I look at my watch, it's 10:35 p.m. and you're all still here. Thank you. That's impressive. And it gives us even more energy for the day of tomorrow. We organized this nightcap session to discuss the future of the liberal international order. Dean Acheson wrote a book, Present at the Creation, in the 1940s, and we thought it might be a nice play of words to talk about present at the destruction, question mark. The liberal international order under threat. I'm delighted that we were able to get Ivan Krastev, who I think is one of the most profound thinkers in Europe about the state of our societies and our governments. So thank you very much, Ivan, that you volunteered to moderate the panel discussion, which we're going to have in a few minutes. And Ivan will, of course, introduce what I think is a brilliant panel, especially since it's so late in the evening. But before the panel, we have an extraordinary event. It is my privilege to welcome back to this stage Vice President Joe Biden, who started what I hope will in the future be considered a tradition that Vice Presidents of the United States will come to the Munich Security Conference. In fact, your successor actually followed in your footsteps. Vice President Penn showed up a year ago, and I'm as delighted as my entire team, and I'm sure our audience here, that you came back this year and are with us. The Vice President, when he served as Vice President during the Obama administration, came to Munich twice. In 2009, it was the first time we had ever had a Vice President of the United States. Former Senator Biden served for, is that correct, 36 years in the US Senate, including as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I remember during my tenure as German ambassador to the United States, I think I delivered an endless line of German parliamentarians to meet with you and your fellow committee members, and you had such great patience. Thank you so much, Mr. Vice President, for that. So, without further ado, what we'll do is we will invite Vice President Biden to address his audience. After that, Ivan will bring the panel up here, and then we'll have a discussion. Mr. Vice President, please take the floor.
Thank you. I think I should leave at this hour. God love you, as my mother would say. It's great to be back, and it's good to be at this conference. I've been coming since the 80s when I was a senator, and I came back, as has been pointed out, as vice president as well. Tonight I'm here in a new role. I'm no longer in government. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and I run a Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. And I've always found this to be one of the most productive, interesting, and important fora where world leaders get together and we actually talk about serious topics, and sometimes we actually do something about them. And it's nice to be back each year. I came here, as was pointed out, in 2009 at the request of President Obama to lay out the first major statement our administration was to make on American and our administration's foreign policy. Hello, Mr. Secretary. and many folks at the time and since then have referred to it as the Russian reset. But my remarks in 2009 were much more than attempting to reset our relationship with Russia. We laid out in uncompromising terms, uncompromising principles that about how the world should be organized and how relationships between nations should be maintained. At the time, I said, specifically with regard to our relationships with Russia, I said, we will not recognize any nation having spheres of influence. It will remain our view that sovereign states have the right to make their own decisions and to choose their own alliances. Nations represented in this room built the post-World War II liberal international order. And we did it, and our fathers and mothers did it, to limit the capacity of any nation, large or small, to abuse power on the global stage. That was the essence of what we were attempting to do. And to me, that goal remains as consequential as it ever was. And I think we have to remind our publics as well how consequential it is to their lives and to their well-being. Because today, the Kremlin and President Putin are doing everything in their power to deconstruct that order, in my opinion, to weaken NATO, to undermine Western democracies, and to break apart this transatlantic partnership. I don't think it is designed to rebuild the Soviet Union. It is one man's opinion. I think it is to deconstruct the liberal world order. And the reason why I think he and the Kremlin are doing this, in my humble opinion, is naked self-preservation, not of Russia, but of their naked self-interest. It's easier for the Kremlin to push the fault lines of Western society than to address the gaping fractures in their own country and governance, the fragility of their multi-ethnic state, the stranglehold of oil and gas on their economy, their network of partnerships held together solely through coercion, and the fact that their population is aging and shrinking. By almost any objective measure, this is a country and a nation in serious decline, by any historical measure. To cover these challenges, I believe the Putin regime, both at home and abroad, seeks to project an aura of invincibility, one that masks how shallow the roots of public support are at home, particularly among younger, urban, and educated Russians. There is nothing more than weakness masquerading as strength, as I see it at this moment coming out of the Kremlin. The Kremlin is threatened by the spread of democratic ideals wherever they are, but particularly on their borders, because any alternative that can attract support jeopardizes the wealth, power, and privilege of those oligarchs in charge. So we understand all too clearly the why motivating Putin's actions and the Kremlin's actions, but we also know, I believe, the how. We have consistently observed Russia's abuse of its power by using its hard military power to violate the sovereignty of Georgia and Ukraine, manipulating energy supplies to influence and coerce their neighbors throughout Europe, adapting and honing information warfare to meddle in democracies all around the world, not just in Europe and the United States. While seeing it as elections approach this year, we'll see more of it in Mexico and throughout Latin America. As I speak, it's occurring. And fourthly, by weaponizing corruption around the globe as a way of co-opting foreign leaders, undermining democracies from the inside out. Each of these acts on its own is outrageous, in my view, but taken together, they constitute a dagger aimed at the heart of that liberal world order. It's purposeful, it's insidious, and unless we recognize the seriousness of their assault on our basic democracy and respond accordingly, I believe we imperil the very future we have so long pursued in this transatlantic partnership. So tonight, I'd like to offer a few and emphasize brief recommendations for action that we should seek to implement together, in my view. First, I think we have to double down on our alliances that are the very foundation of this liberal world order. We should be working closely across NATO and the EU countries to counter threats, both military and non-military. And yes, that means allies should invest and strengthen their own defenses and deterrence capabilities, but we should also repeatedly acknowledge Article 5 means something to every single solitary member of NATO. And it means taking care not to undermine or damage that solidarity that keeps us lashed together through every storm in the past, and I believe we'll do it in the future. Article 5 commitment should be sacrosanct. The trust and credibility represented by that commitment, an attack on one is an attack on all, is at the very core of this alliance. And I believe any one of the members of the United States Congress, and many are here tonight and tomorrow, with whom I traveled here, would tell you the same thing, irrespective of party. How else can we effectively work together to build our resilience against this Russian influence? Well, if Europe and the United States don't continue to stand together as partners of first resort, fighting for our shared values, be reassured that the rest of the world will start to change their strategic calculations about where they stand. Second point I'd like to make, we all have to work harder to reduce the vulnerabilities that exist and to strengthen resilience against Russian meddling in our own countries. Some of that means improving our cyber maintenance, securing computer networks, running our critical infrastructures, partnering with private media and technology companies to learn how to address foreign disinformation campaigns. So it's going to require hard reforms to our political systems and our financial sectors, including in the United States. There's a desperate need in my country for campaign finance reform for a simple reason. All the changes that have taken place in the last 4 years have limited access and vision into who is contributing what. Increased the prospects exponentially of being able to influence outcomes as a consequence of contributions. Quite frankly, gone a long way to eliminate, in many cases, transparency. It matters who is contributing to what advertisements, what campaign initiatives in each of our countries. Our publics have a right to know. Because of the changes we made in our the way we finance our elections, there's too much money and far too little transparency, giving Russia and, quite frankly, other foreign powers opportunities to meddle in unseen ways with real consequence. I thought I knew a lot about this area, but I must tell you, in the aftermath of the election, and I'm not making a reference to whether anything having to do with President Trump, in the aftermath of this last election, to find out the thousands of paid ads on social media, the thousands of ads we were unaware of on Facebook, the thousands of attempts to meddle and influence American public opinion without having any idea what the source was until recently. Time will not permit, you'll all be asleep by the time the panel gets up if I go into it, but there are indictments today in the United States of America on Russian entities for what we have known for some time has been going on in terms of trying to impact on our electoral process. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, it's irrelevant to me who they were trying to influence, vote for or against. They have no damn right. No right whatsoever. It's our sovereign right to be able to conduct our elections unfettered, period. And what we can't do is what is tending to be said now by those who don't want to take a harder look. How many times have you heard, which I never thought I'd hear, I've been doing this a long time, well, there's nothing to be done. Nothing to be done. Well, ladies and gentlemen, at a time which I will not take, there's a great deal to be done. A great deal that can be done. And the most basic thing of all, in my view, is to expose in plain, simple language, understandable and factual, to all our constituents exactly what is happening. Exactly what is happening. Not in mumbo-jumbo, not in foreign policy speak, in simple, plain language. What is going on? Because the majority of our people, we have not attempted to educate as to what is actually going on. Exposing just how pernicious the Kremlin's activities are and attempting to undermine our sovereignty will go a long way to awakening the people in each of our countries. And that is half the battle. The ability to have malign influence evaporates when people are aware where the influence and the rationale behind it is. It's half the battle. And I must say, I don't think any of us are doing, particularly the United States, is doing a particularly good job in making that clear to our publics. Because disinformation campaigns are only effective when people don't see them. When they understand that some outside party is trying to manipulate them, they are much less susceptible, and the arguments being made seldom go very far at all. This leads to my third point. It's critical that we tell the whole story, the true story. We have to document the breadth and scope of Putin's full actions so that our population grasps the gravity of what's occurring. I recently wrote an article for Foreign Affairs, and in that I point out the starting point for this in the United States would be the creation of an independent, nonpartisan commission to examine Russia's assault on American democracy, establish a common understanding of the scope and complexity of the threat, and to identify the tools required to combat it. But I've subsequently come to the conclusion, after being importuned by a number of European leaders, that we shouldn't do this alone, because it's not just America. This affects us all. We should consider standing up an international commission to examine Russia's malign activities across the board. And in the past few weeks, as I said, I've had conversations with senior European elected and unelected leaders from across the political spectrum in Europe. And I've seen real interest in considering setting up such a commission. Because we all have to do better at coordinating information to root out Russian subversion, to identify corrupt networks, to prosecute money laundering and financial crimes. Authorities and the private sector should be doing more together to counteract this meddling as well. And once we know everything the Kremlin was up to, we have to impose real consequences for their aggressive behavior, whether it's violating national sovereignty or interfering with our elections. And that's the fourth step. For the Kremlin, it's simple logic. What they're doing is to foment division and distrust in Western democracies, and it's working. And they're keeping it going until we begin to change the cost-benefit ratio for them. We have to stand up, united, and impose costs on Russia for its violations of international law and other countries' sovereignties, those it has committed and those that it is planning to continue. We can't let up on sanctions that the United States and the EU levied on Russia in response to the invasion of Ukraine. It's not just pressuring Moscow to resolve the conflict in real terms, although that is of paramount importance. It's a critical signal to the Kremlin that we mean what we say, that we're not going to stand idly by and just issue an invitation for them to do more. Putin has to know the cost of this behavior in the long run will certainly outweigh the benefit it perceives now. And the fifth and final point I'd like to make is that even as we stand firm in our defense of democracy, we can't quit talking to Russia or trying to work with them on critical issues like strategic stability, because the stakes are much too high. Even at the height of the Cold War, we found ways to work together. We need crisis communication channel with Russia as much as we ever did. We can't risk misunderstandings leading to war, not between two nuclear superpowers with military assets deployed in close proximity to each other. We have to tone down this new foolish rhetoric that I haven't heard since I was a 29-year-old United States Senator about the feasibility of the use of certain nuclear weapons. It is so irresponsibly dangerous. We need to avoid loose talk and destabilizing arms race. And in those narrow circumstances where our interests do converge, we need to find a way to work together, as we did in our administration. Through everything, in my view, we have to continue to reach out to the Russian people. We have to reach out to the Russian people and stand with Russia's civil society. Because at the end of the day, this is not a conflict between Russia and the West. It is a conflict between a Russian kleptocracy and the Russian people. That's the real conflict. We need to make clear that distinction every chance that we get, and that means being more active on the information front with the truth, not disinformation. Not to promote propaganda, but tell the Russian people the truth and where we stand. And the truth is, this is all about a small group in the Kremlin willing to do whatever it takes to protect themselves and keep their illegal grip on power and money, which is power. The United States has not always been the perfect guardian of this new order after World War II. When we fail to live up to our own values, we do nothing but provide fodder for the forces of illiberalism. Our administration was certainly not perfect. We made missteps. But over 8 years, President Obama and I consistently worked to ensure that the United States would lead not merely by the example of their power, but by the power of our example. This is a defining challenge, I believe, for the foreign policies of all our countries moving forward. And it's one I've spoken frequently about in my home country. For if we fail to make the case of a world led by a common set of values, we risk slipping back into the traps of prior generations, succumbing to raw nationalism that pits us against them rather than building from a shared narrative of freedom and democracy, which we've done since the end of World War II. Falling prey to phony populism that dissolves that invisible moral fabric that holds up all civilized societies, the customs and norms that make free societies work and which hold together our democracies. We already know where that leads. All we have to do is read not-so-distant histories. But I can say without exaggeration, in spite of the challenge we face, if we stay together, I have never been more optimistic about our collective future than any time in my entire life. I believe in the resilience of this transatlantic alliance and community and the democratic values that uphold it. I believe we have an unrivaled capacity to address the challenges before us and lead the world to a future that we all want to see, a future of limitless possibilities and opportunities for every single child on this planet. The things that are about to happen in the next 2 to 10 years are mind-blowing. They can have such a positive impact on the rest of the world. Someone sitting in my place 5 years from now speaking here, we will have gone a long way to curing cancer. We'll be flying subsonically before the next decade is out at 22,000 miles an hour around the globe. We'll be making changes that are absolutely mind-blowing. Before we get to the 2030, we have the capacity to have a planet that is basically its energy basically generated by renewable energy. There's so many things within our capacity. We have the best educated populations, the most resilient population. We have so much, not only offer our own citizens, but the rest of the world. As I said, I think we have an unrivaled capacity. And I'm still hopeful that the time will come, and will not come in the near future, but eventually, the people of Russia will look west and not in that deep black hole they've been staring into for the last part of 150 years or longer. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we already know how to do this, but I do believe we have to start to speak up. We have to hear our voices. They must be louder. They must be louder. Talking about our shared values, our common purpose that first drove us to envision and build this world order over 7 decades ago, creating the most resilient alliances in the history of mankind, generating more prosperity in a 70-year period than any period exceeding 250 years before this. So folks, it's time for us to get up, pick our heads up. Remember who the hell we are. Start to take back the dialogue that's going on around the world. Like I said, I never thought I'd live to see this naked nationalism be given legitimacy in so many parts of the world, and this phony populism designed is just to clear the space to allow the strongest to struggle for power and dominate. So folks, I'm sorry to keep you so late, but it's getting a little late for us not to speak up in unison. Thank you all very much.
We're up. Yvonne.
Good to see
Hi.
you. How's life?
Good
Good to see you.
to see you too.
Foreign Minister.
Please.
You again. Wat eventjes.
Really good.
Yeah. 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 So probably we should try to start. Because we have an interesting topic and it's a really great panel. And we heard the Vice President. What I checked is that in the legislation of the all countries presented, deprivation of sleep is classified as torture. So from this point of view, we should end up tonight So we are not going there. You know all these people. I'm not going basically to waste time representing their CVs. I'm also going to save you time of my view of the state of liberal order. I'm just going to quote a very different vice president who many years ago, Dan Quayle, American vice president, said, "The future will be better tomorrow." And I do believe from this point of view, it has something to do with the liberal order. And I very much want to go first to the Dutch Prime Minister, because Vice President Biden very much stressed the Russian role in challenging the liberal order. And the Russians are weaponizing mistrust. They're not the ones that are producing most of this mistrust. And from this point of view, to what extent the external and the internal challenges to liberal order are something that we should take seriously and how to do it? Please, Mr. Rutte.
Yes, well, that's the easy question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I do believe Joe Biden was right in stating that we have to fight for the liberal world order. And I think he was making some very pointed remarks on what Russia is doing these days. And we've seen what they have done in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, setting up the Eurasia Union, and more or less getting other countries involved who are not always too much willing to enter in that Eurasia Union. So it's very clear what the policy is. But here is the point. We can be bystanders and looking at all of this, but that is not the answer. We have to step up our game and explain to our people in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the United States, why the international world order is still crucial for our future well-being, both economically as well as in terms of our collective security. For example, European Union. We had elections in the Netherlands, and we always have this debate about the European Union, and should we stay part of it, and we have Brexit now. And the interesting thing is that with Russia, and what is happening, of course, in Syria and in the north of Africa, that it helped me and the politicians in the Netherlands to explain why a multilateral organization like the EU or NATO or the UN is crucial for a smaller country. We are a G20 country, we are the 17th economy in the world, but we are not that big as France or the US or Germany. To stay safe, to stay secure, that we have to be embedded in strong international organizations, and if that is the case, that we have to invest in these organizations in terms of why they are there and what the narrative is why we need them. Particularly now that around Europe there is this ring of instability around the European Union. That's one. And secondly, because we simply cannot any longer handle the difficult big issues alone. Take the Paris Climate Agreement. We could never have done that as individual countries. Take the JCPOA on Iran, the action on plan on Iran. We could never have done that in a sort of bilateral way. And also big countries like China are still investing in the WTO, in the UN, in international organizations. So I think that's what we have to do. We cannot just from sitting at the bench, commenting on Russia, oh, it's all bad. No, we have to make very clear to our people, and that's the best way to fight the wrong sort of populism in the Netherlands, in Canada, in France, everywhere in the Western world, why we need that international world order.
Thank you very much. And going to the Japanese foreign minister, if you're working from Japan, what you're going to see as the major challenges to this liberal order?
Thank you. Good evening. First, on the security front, I think the NPT regime, the cornerstone of international non-proliferation order, is now under attack. Let me show you this photo. This is something we caught. A North Korean tanker sitting next to another tanker. They sit together for 6 hours doing ship-to-ship transfer of petroleum. North Korea, with its continued ambitions that include removing United States forces from the Korean Peninsula and reunifying the Korean Peninsula on their terms, sees nuclear weapon as important means to achieve their goal. This is exactly why we should never accept a nuclear-armed North Korea. If we accept a nuclear-armed North Korea, I'm afraid it's going to be the end of the NPT regime. So we should not be blinded by their term offensive. So we need to continue keeping pressure on North Korea and keeping the NPT regime safe. And the second, I think there is attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion. See the South China Sea or East China Sea, there have been many attempts to change the status quo. And it is not just by the political or military activities, it's more of an economic or social attempt to change the status quo. Let me talk about infrastructure. There's a lot of demand for infrastructure in Asia, Africa, and Middle East. And it's good to have a good quality infrastructure to satisfy the demand. But if you look at it, there are a lot of infrastructure projects that never consider transparency or economic soundness or not about the recipient country's economy. So we have to be careful not to be manipulated through the infrastructure investment. And we used to believe economic growth would lead to democracy. But in reality, it has not. For the last 20 years, the global GDP has increased, 240%. But the number of the country that has parliamentary democracy is actually going down. The state capitalism, the economic growth by state capitalism does not lead to democracy. The state capitalism creates a middle class that has strong connection to existing government. Those middle class, I think, status quo is a good thing. Democracy that might bring about a change is not a welcome. So we need a real market economy. We need a real capitalism. We need a real free trade to protect our democracy, rule of law, and basic human rights. So in that context, I think Japan and Europe should work together. We are now trying to finalize EPA between Japan and Europe. SBA is almost done. So there's a lot of things we can do together. And United States has been the biggest and foremost contributor to the liberal international order. And now we need to help our indispensable partner, United States, through burden sharing and cooperation. We need the United States to keep the international order, which is based on liberalism and the rule of law. So I think it's time for us to work together.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you know that Chrystia Freeland is the Foreign Minister of Canada. Probably you don't know that she's the author of probably one of the best books written about Russia in the 1990s. And I'm saying this because Vice President Biden talked a lot about Russia. I'm trying to ask a very simple question. When we talk about the crisis of liberal order, exactly what we're afraid of? The crisis of our value? The crisis of the power of the West? Or basically the rise of disorder in the world and basically starting to live in the world which we don't understand anymore, with technological changes, with political changes, and so on. So I do believe you're the right person to answer.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ivan. And I used to be a journalist, and I used to interview Ivan a lot, so maybe that's why he paid the compliment to my book, but thank you very much.
I'm not so self-interested.
You know, I think that is a very good question, and in some ways it echoes the question you asked the Prime Minister, which is, is this just about the international order, or is it about what's happening at home too? Yeah. And I think that it is really about both. I think the international liberal order starts with strong liberal democracies at home. And, speaking for Canada, our government really believes in doubling down on a small L liberal society and small L liberal values. We really believe in the open society. We believe in being open to immigration, in being open to trade. And if that seems like, kind of kumbaya-ish, I don't know, from the 60s or 70s, we did get elected 2 years ago, and we're going to have an election in 2 years, and we intend to get reelected. And, we do feel there is strong public support in Canada for being open to the world when it comes to trade, for being open to immigration. We say our diversity is our strength, and we really mean it. My city of Toronto, 50% of the people in Toronto are born outside Canada. 76% of the people in Toronto either are born outside Canada or their parents are born outside Canada. And it works. So you can be an open liberal society and you can prosper and flourish. I think a key part of it, Yvonne, and I think it is so important because, this kind of nativism rejection of the international order, it starts with angry populism at home. And our view is the way you stop that is by addressing those anxieties of your middle class at home. You need to support your middle class. You need to be sure that people feel secure. You need to be sure they feel they will have jobs. Yvonne talked about the jobs of the future, that their children will have jobs. You need to spend money on a social welfare net, on skills training. And that is, we have put our money where our mouth is. We're doing that. And we really believe that a confident, secure middle class will look optimistically on the world and at openness to the world. Now, when it comes to the liberal international order and the threats it faces and what we should do in confronting them, as you know, Yvonne, I lived in Russia and Ukraine for most of the 90s, and I think Vice President Biden made some very important remarks this evening. I think we need to be very mindful of and thoughtful about the threat to the rules-based international order posed specifically by Russian aggression against Georgia and against Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Ukrainian territory. And Canada is very engaged in that effort. We and the United States are the only two NATO countries that have to fly across the Atlantic to get to NATO meetings. But we believe in European security because we think that rules-based order is essential for us all. We are leading one of the 4 NATO enhanced forward presence battalions. We are in Latvia. We are training, there are 200 Canadian men and women in uniform in Ukraine today, training Ukrainian soldiers because we believe that Ukraine's security is an issue for the whole world. Tarō spoke about nuclear proliferation and the threat in the world. And the Ukrainian issue really touches on that because Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for the Budapest Memorandum. And if that memorandum means nothing and Ukraine can be invaded and have its territory bitten off, what kind of message does that send to every other would-be nuclear power? And then just in conclusion, for us, that international order is very much also about being open to trade and fighting protectionism. And I really believe we collectively shouldn't give up on that. And the truth is, we are not. You may think protectionism is taking over, but my country has just entered into a closer trading relationship with everybody on this panel. Our trade agreement with Europe, CETA, which we think is the best, most progressive trade deal in the world, entered into force on September 21st. It is a reality, and I would say, thank you, Alonso. Thank you, Prime Minister. And together with Japan, and I really want to thank Tarō for Japanese leadership, we reached an agreement in principle, the TPP 11 countries, and on March 8th, we will sign that agreement. So I think we have to, be confident and move forward, and I really think we can do it.
Yeah. you. But following what you said and going to the Spanish foreign minister, in this moment the biggest problem is obviously the United States is trying to rethink part of its role in the world, particularly also with respect to the liberal order. What is the role for the European Union? Because here's the problem. On one level, there was, in my view, quite unrealistic expectations at some point that as if European Union can keep the liberal order on its own. On the other, I have the feeling that now we start to talk in the way as if that if there is a major crisis of the liberal order, if the Americans are not committed, what we can do. So I'm very much interested, seeing from Spain, what is the role of the European Union as a political actor when we talk of this liberal international order?
Well, I think the role of the European Union is a critical one. We in Spain have always believed in multilateralism, in effective multilateralism, as our guiding principle in foreign affairs. But of course, we cannot do it, alone. I have always thought that in these multilateral arrangements, the US and Europe should be on the same side. But sometimes it is inevitable that we disagree on some policies. We try to convince our partners, the indispensable partner, as was said before, to stick to the principles of the international liberal order, to the rules that govern that liberal order. But sometimes we disagree. When we disagree, I think it's the role of the European Union to keep those values and those principles and push hard with other areas where those values are shared. And I'm particularly thinking of Latin America, where I see that most of our values, even our interests and our principles, are also shared. And I think the role of the European Union is key in maintaining that, in supporting the UN and supporting all those fora where the principles that sustain and support the international liberal order are defended. We don't believe, as Chrystia was saying before, in a retreat into ourselves, into protectionism. Spain is one of the most open economies, certainly in Europe, but also in the world. So we are very much in favor of keeping those relationship in terms of trade, open investment, and I think the European Union is the driving force, and we all have to try and convince our American partners to stay together. But if not, we have to go on and having those partnerships and working with our friends in different areas of the world to preserve that liberal order.
Thank you very much. You have these 4 very powerful views coming from people in government. But if somebody in a certain way is experiencing the crisis of liberal order most physically, these are people who are doing the defense of human rights in places in which they are much more violated than before. And from this point of view, my question to Ken Roth is the following. You have been going there. There was always been a kind of a difficult places in the world. But what strikes me is the following. We talk here about crisis of liberal order. You're going to see a lot of criticism coming from other countries. But nobody is coming with an alternative. If you go to most of these places, nobody is going to say, we're against the liberal order. They're always going to say, we're against the hypocrisy of the West. So how it happens that liberal order is in crisis and there is no alternative being proposed by anybody?
Well, Ivan, I think there is an alternative. I mean, the premise of this panel that it's the liberal international order that's threatened. Let's focus on the liberal. I mean, this is not just our team versus their team. The liberal means government constrained by rights and the rule of law. Government with checks and balances on executive authority. That's the alternative. Now that is under attack, as we all know, by a group of autocratic populists. And a year ago at this conference, everybody was panicking because it looked like they were in the ascendancy. I think the real news this year has been the resistance. And we've seen in many places that there has been a willingness by political leaders to stand up for the alternative, for democratic values. And so I think we saw it most markedly in Emmanuel Macron's presidential campaign. We've seen it in the United States with civil society and judges and journalists and marchers standing up to Trump and limiting some of the damage that he's done. Europe has finally awoken to the fact that Viktor Orban in Hungary and Jarosław Kaczynski in Poland represent a threat to European values, and suddenly they've discovered Article 7 of the European Treaty, and they're threatening at least sanctions. If you look elsewhere in the world, I mean, you speak about Latin America having common values. 11 Latin governments, the so-called Lima Group plus Canada, have stood up outspokenly to Nicolas Maduro's decimation of Venezuelan democracy, something that really is not typically done in a region that's much more concerned with avoiding imperialist overreach. And so, you look around the world and you see this resistance. Now, the problem is when there is not that resistance, the autocrats have flourished. And so in Turkey, the EU is much more worried about Erdogan stopping refugees, so they closed their eyes to Erdogan's destruction of Turkey's democracy. In Egypt, Europe has been much too willing to buy into Sisi's claim that he's providing regional stability, and he has crushed civil society. And you can go around the world. I mean, in China, one leader after another goes there and is much more worried about Chinese contracts than the rights of the Chinese people. And we are now facing, under Xi Jinping, the worst crackdown since the Tiananmen Square era. And so even in Burma, Myanmar, I think there's been a much too great deference to Aung San Suu Kyi as the arbiter of what the world should do, even though she's not willing to even say the word Rohingya in public. And the result is 688,000 ethnically cleansed Rohingya sitting in Bangladesh today. So what I take away from this is that, yes, there's an alternative. We've got to fight for it. When we do, it's possible to limit the damage. When we don't, there's a lot of damage to be done.
Thank you very much. Thanks to incredible self-discipline of the people on the panel, we have 20 minutes for real discussion. But I just want to touch on one thing that basically goes through several. We are talking about the changes of the domestic liberal order. And honestly speaking, I see a major shift, probably because of where I'm coming, Central Europe and others. And the difference is the following. Liberal order was very much about the rights of minorities. What we see all over is a shift towards a kind of a much more majoritarian understanding of rights. I have been reading a lot of public opinions recently. Basically, people still believe of rights, but this time it's very much the rights of majorities. If before the idea was about recognition, and the recognition is I'm different but wanted to be treated equal, now it's very much about respect. President Putin also likes to say that Russia is not respected, which means that we should also keep in mind the power asymmetries. We are equal, but we are not equal in our powers. And I'm saying this because when we're defining this, for me the most interesting is when we're defending exactly what we're defending. And this is not an easy question, and I do believe that we are going to go back to you, but before giving you a chance once more to reflect on what's going on, I want to ask 3 or 4 persons, if we have time, to ask their questions. My idea is to answer of all questions after that and to go once more through the panel. The first question here, there is a rule. Every first question in this session is asked by some of the young leaders that have been invited, and I have the name of the person. And this is Javier Shergill from the Indian National Congress. And if she's here, I'm going to ask her to give the right of the first question. And others, please just signal that you want to speak.
Looking at China's disregard of the tribunal judgment on South China Sea and Russia Crimea, you think the inability of organizations like United Nations, NATO, and tribunals to enforce discipline actually gave birth or rise to the illiberal order? And mere commitment by words is not enough. Now you need to rewrite the rules, not only to prevent bad behavior, but also to ensure obligation on nations to come together to prevent the bad behavior, and there should be actual cost on the nations not coming on a common platform to act together. Because we have many organizations who tell us what good behavior is, but none who punish bad behavior. So that's my
Thank you very much. Who is interested to join the conversation? While you're thinking, there is a very old popular Soviet joke about somebody who was throwing leaflets in front of Kremlin in the 1980s, and when they arrested him, there was nothing written on the leaflets. So the police said, but why? He said, but everything is clear. So probably we have reached the level of clarity, so please.
My name is Reinhard Bütikofer. I have a question regarding China. I was a bit astonished listening to Vice President Biden blaming the attack on the liberal international order mostly on Russian efforts to undermine it without mentioning China at all. And my question to the panel is, isn't possibly China a more challenging adversary in that regard?
It counts as 3 questions because of the size of China. So from this point of view, my idea is, let's start with Ken, because I also find it quite important question, because are we going basically to reduce all our attention to Russia, or there are other external threats? And Ken, let's start with you.
No, I think China in many ways is a more profound threat, because nobody looks at Russia and says, I wish my society was like Russia's. You know, nobody does that. Whereas, you know, many autocrats look at China and say, I wish I was like them. I could be a dictator and my economy could grow at the same time. That'd be great. You know, so it is an attractive model to autocrats. Now, you know, the challenge, of course, is to show that when you have an unaccountable government, that you're gambling. You know, and yes, sometimes you get China, but sometimes you get Venezuela. You know, with, I don't know, what is 140,000% inflation, and you know, an oil-rich country where people don't have food or medicine. Or, you know, you could have Zimbabwe or Congo or many other examples of autocrats where it's an economic basket case. But the Chinese model of, you know, autocratically led economic development is an alternative system that superficially has its appeal. And I think we have to be conscious of that and fight back.
Minister Dastis, where you stand on this?
Well, yes, I do agree. I think that China is also a threat in the sense that they don't share the values that we shared in the international liberal order. But I would say that every country which you know, doesn't have an accountable government, that doesn't have a rule of law based on principles, on separation of powers, on respect of rights of the minorities, rights of the individuals, is a threat to the international liberal order. And I think what we have to do is mostly emphasize the need for respect to that rule of law, both internally and internationally, and also, I think, against the threats of the menaces against the liberal order. Another thing that we have to do is develop inclusiveness as a policy. Because I think one of the threats, one of the reasons behind populism and nationalism as threats to the international liberal order is the exclusion, the division, the fragmentation that they provoke. And this fragmentation and this populism has roots in, Chrystia was saying before, you know, failed expectations, inequalities, fear of the other, be it, you know, the immigrants or other people who do not share your cultural identity or your racial identity. And what we have to develop to be really, you know, to deserve the name of full democracy and defender of the liberal order is inclusiveness, giving opportunities to those that are afraid of the future, and you know, treating people as they are, you know, human beings that deserve to have a decent life wherever they are.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so I'll just make a few comments. You know, I think Tarō actually really said something very important, that we used to think that as countries got richer, they would become more democratic. And that was like an algorithm. It was a truism. And I think that drove a lot of our foreign policy, a lot of our economic policy, a lot of our self-belief in where the liberal international order was going. And I think that China is the strongest seeming counterexample to that. And so that poses a really big ideological challenge, if you will. I think that part of the answer has to be, when we talk to ourselves, to our own people, to say, actually the values part matters too. Liberal democracy, yes, it's about all of us becoming more prosperous, but the values matter as well. And it is about a chicken in every pot, but it's also about being able to be free. It's about being able to live comfortably with diversity. It's about being able to love who you choose. It's about being able to express yourself on that blank sheet of paper. So I think we have to really be mindful about how we sell liberal democracy so that we're selling the true parts of it. There was a comment, the first question was sort of about China and then also about lack of enforceability of rules. It's an excellent point. And certainly as foreign minister, you can often feel you spend a lot of time saying words and kind of wondering when they actually will bite. There's one organization that has great international enforceability of rules, and it is called the WTO. And it is under some strain right now. And those of us who believe in the liberal international order should be supporting the WTO very, very strongly. And then finally, I have a comment to your comment, Ivan, about majoritarianism.
Yeah.
And, it used to be all about rights for minorities. Now it's about majorities asserting themselves. For me, this is one reason that we believe in Canada in being feminists and in having a feminist foreign policy and in being feminists at home. Because guess who is actually the majority in every country? We are called women. And guess who actually has not done great in millennia of patriarchy? Women. When you really empower women, we're not that keen on looking backwards. It wasn't that fantastic. We couldn't vote. It used to be legal for men to beat their wives. Rape in marriage was not actually a thing. It still isn't a thing in some countries. So empowering women is a great way to strengthen liberal democracy, even in this majoritarian age, because actually there's more of us.
So from liberal order to feminist order, I agree. And now going basically to Japan's view on China's role, in a certain way, because you have also a choice. If you don't want to talk China, you can talk Russia. It's up to you.
In order to preserve liberal international order, if some country behave irresponsible, I think the country need to pay some cost. We need force country to pay the cost if they violate international rules. During the Cold War, I think we were able to do that because not many countries had a trade with Soviet Union. We can simply contain Soviet Union. But now China, for the most countries, China is the largest trading partner. Mm-hmm. So you have to choose. You have to force China to pay the cost for violating international rule, or you can look the other way and keep the trade with China. So I think China needs to grow according to the international order peacefully. If China grows peacefully according to the liberal international order, it'll be beneficial for everybody. So can we get China engaged into it? Chinese Communist Party used to depend on its ideology for its legitimacy. But now China moved into market economy. So the Communist Party need to find a different set of legitimacy. I think it is economic growth. if China can grow economically, and if they could provide a better life for the Chinese people, I think the Communist Party is legitimate to the eyes of Chinese. So I think we need to help China grow economically, and they need to grow with liberal international order. So we need to get them engaged. We need us to get engaged with China. So there's a lot of things we have to do. In order to do that, I think we have to stand united. And if we can stand united and talk to China, ask them to come along with liberal international order, I think it's helpful and it would be beneficial for everybody. The same thing can be said to Russians as well.
Thank you, Prime Minister, because you're going to have the last word. I have one more question. China, you're not going to escape from this. But if you go to Europe, 5 years ago, the major question that Europeans have been asking themselves is how we're going to transform our neighbors. Now my feeling the question is how not to allow our neighbors to transform us. And this goes also with the refugee issues and others and so on. To what extent there is a support, citizens and voters support, for a much more active liberal engagement with world? You're facing voters all the time.
Yeah, very good question. First of all, let me say that I completely agree with the Japanese Foreign Minister on what he said about China. But now I want to be a bit more provocative. The biggest risk we are running here as high priests of the international liberal order is arrogance.
Arrogance.
Why is arrogance a risk? First of all, nationally, when we are confronted with populism. I am not against populism. I think populism is a very good thing. We are all populist politicians because we are there to represent the people. And that's at the core of the word populism. There's, of course, a wrong sort of populism, which is not providing any answers to real problems, not making any assessment of what needs to happen, is only trying to stir up controversy. That's a sort of wrong sort of populism we have to fight. But if we are just telling our populations, hey guys, you are voting for a populist party, so you are not a good citizen, we are arrogant, and we will be voted out of office, and the population is completely right. And the arrogance also has to do with our international relationships. Yes, in the European Union we're facing a few big issues with countries like Hungary and Poland, where we are discussing in depth our common values as a European Union. And we have to do this. But take, for example, the relationship between Europe and the United States. And this already started with Obama, who was having this pivot towards Asia. And we're all saying in Europe, oh, the US is having this pivot towards Asia. Where are we? And now Trump came, and of course he is continuing, engaging also with Asia. But the thing we have to do is not to think arrogantly, we are better because we are the high priest of the international liberal world order. No, we have to engage with the US. We have to anchor them in a transatlantic relationship. So it's not just commenting on Donald Trump. No, judging him by his deeds, what he is actually doing, even if we do not like everything he is doing, because US is still the leader of the free world, and we have to keep them involved in maintaining the international world order. The only way to do that is to anchor them in a transatlantic relationship. I'm absolutely convinced. So my statement would be that the biggest risk the international world order at this moment is facing is the arrogance by its high priests.
Okay.
Thank you very much. On arrogance, we can go to sleep. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.